The Blueprint for Black Power, Chapter 1, Competent and Legitimate Authority as Power, Section Legitimate Authority. Legitimate authority refers to a power relation in which the power holder possesses an acknowledged right to command and the subject an acknowledged obligation to obey. Quote, the source rather than the content of any particular command endows it with legitimacy and induces willing compliance on the part of the person to whom it is addressed. End quote. Wrong, 1988. Authority can be said to be legitimate to the extent it conforms to established rules, to the extent to which the rates used to justify it are based on shared beliefs or norms and are based on the express consent of the subject, that is, on the extent to which the subject consents to the particular relations of power which the exercise of such authority requires. Beetham, 1991. The norms which constitute a legitimate authority relationship are generally shared within a larger group or community to which both the person exercising that authority and the person subject to it belongs. Interestingly, as Wrong notes, submission to legitimate authority is widely regarded as voluntary and based on consent rather than coercion, and yet at the same time is felt to be mandatory or obligatory. We must keep in mind that legitimate authority and the power relations it entails are based on the acceptance by those who submit to it of certain beliefs, values, rules, and modes of giving consent. Example, voting. The functional superiority of legitimate authority as a form of power is delineated by Wrong thusly. Quote, legitimate authority creates far greater reliability of anticipated reactions than other forms of authority, just as internalized social norms ensure more reliable conformity than norms the observance of which is more dependent on situational sanctions or ad hoc negotiations over their meaning and applicability. Legitimate authority is more efficient than coercive or induced authority in that it minimizes the need for maintaining means of coercion and constant readiness, continual surveillance of the power subjects, and regular supplies of economic or non economic rewards. For these reasons, naked, that is, coercive power, always seeks to clothe itself in the garments of legitimacy. Or, as Franz Newman put it even more strongly, quote, those who wield political power are compelled to create emotional and rational responses in those whom they rule, inducing them to accept implicitly or explicitly the commands of the rulers, end quote. To a significant degree, African Americans accept and obey predominant white American power and its authorities, at least from a social psychological standpoint, because they agree with the rules of their establishment and expression as defined by white Americans, share with white Americans the moral, legal, and other values and perspectives which justify them, and to some extent, limited and of recent origin, because they, that is, blacks, have been permitted by white Americans to participate in political and social processes by which white power is given legitimacy. To a limited degree, African Americans have been permitted access to certain positions of competent and legitimate authority. These factors contribute mightily to the acceptance of white American power and the white American monopoly of positions of authority as legitimate. These forms of giving consent to the social power status quo on the part of blacks helps to obscure as well as deny the fact that they are in fact a dominated and severely exploited group regardless of class, and helps to obscure the fact that their uncritical acceptance of the rules, moral beliefs, perspectives, and their customary traditional participation in the quote American end quote political economic process and system is tantamount to the legitimation of their own oppression and to the consensual insurance of their own powerlessness. Rules, beliefs, and consent are manufactured by those in power to justify, legitimate, and serve their interests. In its origins, white American power was not legitimated, that is, voluntarily or contractually consented to, morally justified, or politically socially ratified by African Americans who, at the time of its origination, were held in captivity, and to this point in time have been largely excluded from significantly participating in American legitimation processes. From the historical point of view of Native and African Americans, white power, in whatever form, is illegitimate. This is because such power rests essentially on the near physical and genocidal decimation of Native Americans, the theft of their properties, on the exploitation or forced labor of Africans, and on the systematic exclusion by whites of both Black and Native Americans from the influential exercise of practically all forms of, quote, legitimate, end quote, power and authority in the United States. The rules and beliefs which provide the means for legitimating white power were in fact pre-established, preordained, and imposed on blacks against their will by whites from the beginning. The illegitimacy of white American power is founded on the illegitimacy of its original sins: genocide, theft of property, and enslavement. It is apropos to note here a very telling statement made by Beetham in regard to power and legitimacy. Quote, the occupancy of property, the development of a hierarchical division of labor, or the establishment of a command structure can occur, and historically frequently has occurred, through acts of forcible appropriation, exclusion, or subjection which take place in violation of existing rules or outside of them, even those promulgated by the usurpers themselves. Such usurpations cannot be legitimate. However, the resulting power relations typically become consolidated and perpetuated through the establishment of rules which underpin and give legal form to the original usurpation. From that time on, subsequent positions of power come to be derived from the rules in the same way those rules originate through custom or agreement. Although the memory of the original usurpation may be kept alive, with the passage of time, the issue of the rule's legitimacy becomes less a question of their origin than one of the ongoing character of the relationship they embody and the nature of the requirements they impose. Here lies the reason why power is not necessarily legitimate even when it is legally valid. That legality constitutes only one dimension of legitimacy. It is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for it. End quote. Our questioning of the legitimacy of white power, particularly white American power, does not amount to a call for the overthrow of the American government. However, it does amount to a call for African Americans to critically examine the origins and functions of the rules, morals, values, customary attitudes and behavior, common perspectives and folkways they have been convinced to accept as a result of white American physical and coercive impositions, ideological propaganda, and conditioning procedures. Uncritical acceptance of Eurocentric rules, morals, customs, and so on by African Americans hides from them the fact that, despite the norms and values they share with white Americans and which serve to legitimate the American social, political, economic system, white Americans possess a preponderant and dangerous power advantage over them. The power advantage of whites places them in position to deny blacks political and economic freedom and survival at will, and enables them to engage in an almost unimpeded genocidal attack against blacks whenever it may suit their power needs to do so. Quote, the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary to maintain its control, kill us. End quote. Therefore, the very vulnerability of African Americans to the arbitrary and injurious application of physical force and coercive power, legitimate and competent authority, and other forms of power now possessed by white America should, in and of itself, motivate them to, as rapidly and judiciously as possible, neutralize such power. This is necessary to Black political economic well being, let alone Black biological survival. The failure of Black Americans to gain access to and fill significant numbers of positions of power and influence in America is not the result of a large number of Black individuals who lack initiative, drive, etc., but is ultimately the result of the nature of the power relations which inhere between white and Black Americans. White Americans, in hypocritically projecting the American political economic system and opportunity structure as egalitarian, that is, as colorblind and race neutral, justify their monopoly of positions of influence and power in terms of their superior individual characteristics, training, experiences, and much else. In other words, according to dominant whites, there is nothing wrong with or racially discriminatory about the white dominated social system, only something wrong with individuals. The largest percentage of those who happen to have something wrong with them just happen to be Black. Many Black Americans give consent to this line of reasoning. Notwithstanding, Beetham's observations in this regard are well worth noting. Quote, however, it is a notable feature of power relations that they are themselves capable of generating the evidence needed for their own legitimation. Thus, the evidence of superiority and inferiority, which justifies the inequality of conditions between dominant and subordinate, is itself largely the product of that condition. Those who are excluded from key positions, activities, or resources are thereby denied the opportunity to acquire or demonstrate the capacities and characteristics appropriate to their occupation or exercise, so justifying their subordinate position. This is true even where relatively open processes of selection are at work, once the selection is performed by an education system which is given the task of preparing children differently for their respective future roles. Evidence about the fitness or appropriateness of people to exercise power thus tends to be structured by the relations of power themselves, and therefore to have a self-fulfilling quality about it. If we look finally at consent, then we find that it is precisely the lack of some resource or skill deriving from the rules of power themselves that leads the subordinate to voluntary acceptance of their dependency upon the powerful. to their conformity to established rules, and to giving their consent to the particular power relation. End quote. The conditioned consent to ideological acceptance and behavioral conformity of Black Americans to white American political and economic domination as legitimate are designed to blind them to the fact that they can only gain access to and occupy a very significant number of positions of influence and power by creating, developing, and applying ideological action perspectives which go beyond and stand outside the existing relations of power, their supporting social customs, traditions, and arrangements. If blacks are to empower themselves, they must question white originated and self serving rules and ideological justifications for establishing and maintaining white domination as a legitimate expression of power consented to by blacks themselves. These rules and ideological justifications must be directly challenged or subverted by blacks in order to enhance and exercise a black power counter to white power. Even if the American political economic system is now colorblind or race neutral, which most assuredly it is not, this counterfactual situation occurred after 3.5 centuries of white racial prejudice toward and oppression of blacks. It was during this long period that whites developed and accumulated the collective cultural, social, political, familial, and individual capital that their domination of blacks afforded. These accumulated advantages are used by whites, even in a race neutral egalitarian society, to provide themselves with further huge advantages compared to blacks who have suffered 3.5 centuries of accumulated disadvantages. A contemporary race neutral society, in terms of its neutrality alone, would in no way resolve the problem of gross inequalities between whites and blacks. In fact, such a society would function only to maintain, if not in actuality enhance them. Blacks must develop means of overcoming white social, political, and social economic advantages, regardless of the racial status quo.